Hello and welcome to Module 4. In Module 4, we will be discussing several issues, primarily the Duluth model and the impact on victims and the impact on children. I'm not going to address the impact on children in this lecture. It's going to be covered in a different area of the module, and I'll talk about that at the end. So let's get started. Ellen Pence is from Minnesota, and the Duluth model is named after the city of Duluth, Minnesota. Pence was raised there and earned her PhD in sociology. She's a lifelong activist and advocate for women's issues. She worked together with Michael Paymar, who's also from Minnesota, and he served as a member of the Minnesota State House of Representatives for many years. In 1981, Pence and Paymar together worked to develop the Duluth model, which is also called the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project. You may have heard of the Duluth model by name if you've studied domestic violence in other courses or at work. You may have heard of it referred to as Domestic Abuse Intervention Project, and I'm sure you've probably heard of one of the tools that came out of this project, which we'll discuss in detail in just a minute. The Duluth model is based on sociological theory. It's based in sociology. That's really important to remember as we talk more in detail about the program and its goals. In previous modules, we've talked about other theories of domestic violence. For example, psychological theories, how mental illness or mental disorders can have an impact on domestic violence. And we've talked about different biological theories, and there was information in the textbook about some biological bases for domestic violence. The Duluth model has nothing to do with that. The Duluth model is based solely on sociology, and that's important to remember. In our very first module, we talked about patriarchal social systems and patriarchy. And if you remember, that's the philosophy from, remember the medieval expression, a man's home is his castle? A patriarchal social system is one that's based with men being in positions of power. In a traditional patriarchal society, only men can own property, for example. In medieval times, and even a bit later, women were considered to be the property of their husbands, property in the same way a cow or a barn was the property of the husband. And in patriarchal systems, money and property is passed down from fathers to sons, bypassing the wife. So if a woman was widowed in her 30s, which was very common in the olden days, the property, the farm, the horses, the cattle, all means of income were automatically passed to the son, not to the wife, which, as you can imagine, created a serious issue for women who survived their husbands back then. So the foundation of the Duluth model is the belief that patriarchal social systems create conditions that support men's use of violence and power over women. So we're referring to the patriarchal system being the actual foundation of domestic violence. Women are vulnerable to violence from men because they have unequal social, economic, and political status. The underlying premise of the Duluth model is that men perpetrate violence against women because their elevated social status allows them to. It's another way of saying the theory behind the Duluth model is men abuse women because they can get away with it. The society they live in allows them to abuse their partners with little or no consequences. So that's a sociological theory, right? It's based on the structure of the society. The Duluth model, remember, doesn't rely on psychological or biochemical or any other factors. And here's a quote about the Duluth model that's very descriptive. We do not see men's violence against women as stemming from individual pathology, but rather from a socially reinforced sense of entitlement. So again, this isn't about a man being a survivor of childhood abuse and then he later becomes an abusive partner. That would be a psychological theory. Duluth model is not about that. The Duluth model asserts that domestic violence is caused by society, and therefore it can only be addressed or prevented by that society. In order to prevent domestic violence, we have to change the societal conditions that allow it to occur. So, for example, if men and women had equal earning potential, that would erase part of the power imbalance. If men were not permitted by the society to be abusive or dominate their partners, then men wouldn't do it. There's three unique elements about the Duluth model I need you to remember. Going back to medieval times and really up until the 1950s, there was a belief in most societies that women were responsible for the abuse. In much the same way as abusers manipulate victims, we had entire social systems that did the same thing. You all did the essay on why do we ask women to leave abusive relationships instead of asking men why they abuse their partners. This is sort of the essence of that. The Duluth model changed the way we looked at who's responsible for domestic violence. And they looked at the man or the abuser's role in it, and they also looked at the community. It's the entire society's responsibility to create a structure where domestic violence is discouraged, prohibited, it's not rewarded, and there's punishment for it. That the community and the state is responsible for protecting women. Women aren't responsible for protecting themselves from abusers. Communities and the state are. The state would be a reference to law enforcement and the court system. Another unique element of the Duluth model was it provided methods for police, actual instructions on how the courts and other systems can work together to ensure that batterers are held accountable for their abusive conduct. And the word batterers is kind of written in a different font there. That was the word that the Duluth model used, so that's the word I used here. So the unique element is this model, the whole domestic violence intervention project, helped train police and judges and lawyers and other social services agencies how they can work together to hold abusers accountable for their conduct. And the third unique element of the Duluth model was it was the first program to ever offer nonviolence courses to men. So if you think about the late 70s, the early 1980s, this is kind of the apex of the women's movement in the United States. And the founders of the Duluth Project took some flack for even wanting to address or help men at all. The focus was on the women, treating and helping the women. But the founders of the Duluth Project felt very strongly that in order to help this societal change, to help change the way men live in this society, they had to address working with men and helping men find nonviolent ways to work with their partners. So the Duluth model was unique in three ways. It put the focus of responsibility for domestic violence on the society, the community, and the state, meaning law enforcement and the court system, to keep women safe. The second unique element was it provided actual training and instruction for police, courts, lawyers, judges, and other systems to work together to hold abusers accountable. And the third aspect was it was the first program, the first ever domestic violence program in the United States to offer nonviolence courses to men. Today, we probably wouldn't call it a nonviolence course. It would be more likely we called it an anger management course. You've probably heard of those. Now, here's the tool I was referring to from the Duluth model that you've probably seen or heard of. The Duluth model created the wheel of power and control. And I don't expect you to be able to read this on this image. I'm going to show you where you can find a really easy to read image of this. But for example, the Duluth model did not discover that abusers use intimidation to control their victims. They didn't invent that. They certainly weren't the first to discover that. Or they weren't the first to discover that abusers use isolation and economic abuse to control their partners. What the Duluth model did that was a first, which was very innovative, was create this graphic representation of the different types of actions men take to assert power and control over women. So they invented this wheel. They invented this graphic demonstration of the cycle of power and control that abusers use. So did the Duluth model discover that abusers use children to control their partners? Of course not. Many people had researched that issue for many years. But what the Duluth model did was put it in this very compact graphic representation, which makes it really easy to describe and learn about domestic violence. So I know you can't probably read this image here. There's a copy of the wheel in this week's article. So all you need to do is just go to it's either an article or media, but you just click on that link and you'll get a really nice copy of the wheel that you can read, and you can read each section of it. So that's the Duluth model in a nutshell. There's a lot more to learn about the Duluth model, but we're going to move on and we're going to talk about the impact of intimate partner violence on victims. And as you can see, I use the terms domestic violence and intimate partner violence interchangeably. Intimate partner violence is slowly becoming the new or correct term. But of course, as you learned in our last module, New York State's office on this issue is the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. So it will probably be a very long time before all agencies and researchers use the term intimate partner violence, but we're going to use it here. And we're going to discuss briefly the short-term physical impact, the long-term physical impacts, death, PTSD, clinical depression, substance abuse, financial impacts, and legal impacts. Now, we're not going to be able to cover every possible impact that can be had on a victim of domestic violence, but what we're going to do is we're going to cover some of the major ones. And as we're covering them, I want you to think about how this would make it harder for a victim of domestic violence to leave. So as we talk about specific things, I want you to be thinking, how would that make it harder for a domestic violence victim to leave an abusive relationship? And then I also want you to think about how hard would it make it for that victim to recover from the abuse they suffered. So just think about that as we go through these slides. First, we'll address the short-term physical impact. And I don't have a good definition for you for short-term. Short-term could be hours, days, or weeks. And a lot of the short-term physical impact has to do with physical abuse. Bruises, lacerations, which is another way for saying cuts, broken noses, swelling, sprains, sexually transmitted diseases that can be cured, soreness, limping, hair loss, infections. And as we talked about isolation and the way abusers manipulate and control their victims, One way abusers do that is by denying the victim medical treatment, preventing them from going to the hospital or seeing a doctor. And of course, that's going to exacerbate any physical injuries they have because they're not going to receive any medical treatment. Another issue with medical treatment is abusers often force victims into lying to medical providers about what happened to them. And of course, that doesn't help you get good treatment. We try to be as honest and open as we can with our physicians and other medical staff so we can get accurate medical treatment. So if a victim's in an emergency room lying about what happened to them, that's also going to affect the treatment they receive. They could very possibly be misdiagnosed or not receive all the treatment they need because they're not providing full and complete information to the medical provider. And these are just some of the short-term physical impacts of domestic violence. Here's some of our long-term physical impacts. Skull fractures. What you're looking at is a brain scan of a skull. The eyes, nose, and mouth are to the left of the image. All that dark area is the open mouth and the nasal cavities, which appears dark on the screen. To the right of the image, where the arrows are pointing, what you're looking at is a depressed skull fracture. And you can see that a large section of the back of the skull, right in the back of the head, is broken. That's all a fracture means, is a break, right? So it's actually broken in two locations, and the bone has actually been depressed or pushed down into the brain. That's a depressed skull fracture. That is an extremely serious injury. Of course, your brain is in your very hard skull, and your skull does not expand or contract. So when your soft brain swells within that hard, inflexible skull, if that swelling's not relieved, you will die. If the swelling's not relieved quickly, you can have permanent brain injuries. You can suffer paralysis. It's an extremely serious injury that has long-term, often lifetime, devastating effects. Of course, that leads us to traumatic brain injury, what we often call TBIs. TBIs can be caused by all different sorts of traumatic impact to the brain. We often hear discussion about this in the media in relation to football and other contact sports, right? Athletes who are repeatedly concussed, who receive concussions, suffer traumatic brain injuries that has a wide range of impact on behavior and emotional stability, and also pain. Of course, scars are a long-term physical impact. Missing teeth, jaw fractures, burns and scars from burning. Failure to heal, again, that can also be connected to that lack of medical treatment or not getting a good or complete diagnosis because the victim doesn't feel safe being honest about what happened to them. Not receiving medical treatment can also exacerbate a minor injury. So if you were to receive a minor cut on your hand but didn't treat it, of course, that could lead to a serious infection, which is going to have a long-term effect. And of course, some sexually transmitted diseases can only be treated, they can't be cured. So some sexually transmitted diseases are a lifetime physical impact of domestic violence. Death, of course, unfortunately, is one result of domestic violence. These are two statistics it's really important for you to remember. The first is I want you to think about all of the women who were murdered in the United States in any given year. Say last year, 2019. Think of the whole population of women that were murdered nationwide. 65% of those murdered women were killed by an intimate partner, either someone they were in a relationship with or a former partner. 65%. When you look at why men are murdered nationwide, it's to a whole host of circumstances and events. But with women, a woman who's murdered in this country, it's more likely than not, it's 65% likely that she was murdered by an intimate partner. This also explains if you watch shows on television, even the made up invented ones, the fiction TV shows and movies, and especially the real life ones, the documentaries and other shows that show issues about crime and crime resolution and investigation, who's the first person they look at when a woman's murdered? The boyfriend, the husband, the live in, the ex. That's the first person they look at. Well, why? Well, they got a good chance that that's the person who did it. Here's another statistic it's important to remember. And we've talked about this before, and this statistic was in the Leslie Steiner video. 70% of domestic violence homicides occur after the victim ends the relationship. That's really important in explaining why victims don't leave. You may be able to withstand physical abuse or verbal abuse or being manipulated or controlled. Although that's a horrible thing to experience, when compared to death, it might seem like the better option. So a victim may be able to mentally adjust to all different kinds of abuse and maltreatment when they think the only alternative is death. And we know that that's likely, right? Because we know 70% of domestic violence homicides occur after the victim ends the relationship. Post-traumatic stress disorder, what we all call PTSD, this is a psychological trauma, and the symptoms vary greatly between victims. But here's some common symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Hypervigilance, that's that feeling that you can never relax, physically or mentally. You can never, ever let your guard down. You're constantly aware of where you are, what's happening around you, who's around you, all the conditions around you. That's hypervigilance. I have a friend who has post-traumatic stress disorder because he was almost fatally injured serving in Iraq, and he had a horrific traumatic brain injury and almost died numerous times. He was in rehabilitation services for the better part of a year. And he suffers post-traumatic stress disorder from being in combat. And that's how we usually think of PTSD, as related to serving in a war. And he had terrible hypervigilance. And I remember watching him sit with his butt on the very edge of the couch and leaning forward with his hands on his knees as if he was ready to spring at any moment. He literally could not scooch his butt back and put his back on the back of the couch to relax. He felt he couldn't even sit that way in that relaxed position. He always had to be on the very tip of the couch, ready to spring to his feet. And that's a physical example of that hypervigilance. Another symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder is self-destructive behavior. That could mean physical manifestations of self-destructive behavior, like cutting or self-injury. It could also be doing things that are really reckless or dangerous, not being safe, not acting in a safe manner, not being self-protective. Overwhelming shame is a very common feature of PTSD. So is insomnia and nightmares. If you want to see someone's mental health deteriorate very quickly, don't let them sleep for 3 days. That's actually a way people torture prisoners of war. It's an actual technique used against POWs to torture them, is to keep them up and awake for days at a time. It has an incredibly strong impact on your ability to think, on your emotions. It's really a devastating thing. Now, all of us can have insomnia or trouble sleeping every now and then. But post-traumatic stress disorder causes insomnia where people really never sleep. They never sleep well. They might only sleep an hour or two a night. And it has a really devastating impact on their overall mental health. Memory problems, the ability to recall and remember information, is one symptom of PTSD. That hypervigilance also caused people to be easily startled. Someone with PTSD is not someone you want to approach from behind or run up behind them to give them a hug. That can cause a serious startle response and fear in that person. Anxiety, trouble concentrating, and a chronic reliving of events. And it's not just thinking about something that's happened, it's actually seeing it in your mind, feeling what you felt at the time, even feeling the temperature you felt at the time, smelling the smells that were present during an event. It's really real to someone going through it. So you've already suffered this abuse or trauma, and then you have to relive it and re-experience it over and over again. So I saw this image online and I thought it was very interesting. What causes PTSD? And it lists the top 4 reasons men suffer PTSD and the top 4 reasons women suffer PTSD. So first we'll start with the guy side. The number 1 reason was rape, sexual assault. 2 was combat exposure. Again, we talked about that, having those types of experiences in the military and being exposed to that extreme forms of violence and death. Childhood neglect, and childhood physical abuse. And let's look over at the women's list. Number 1 is also rape. Number 2 is sexual molestation. 3 is physical attack. And 4 is being threatened with a weapon. Very different psychological responses in men and women. Now, of course, combat exposure will be seen very infrequently in a list about women because in this country, women, although they have combat roles, we don't have the same number of women in combat roles that we do men. So that's going to be more frequently listed for men. But look at the women's side and think, how many of these things happen in a relationship with domestic violence? All 4 of them: rape, sexual molestation, physical attacks, and being threatened with weapons. Just interesting. We're going to talk more about the effects of domestic violence on children in this week's article. We're going to spend 3 weeks after the midterm on child neglect, child abuse, and child exploitation. So we have a lot more we're going to be learning about those topics. Clinical depression is another impact of being the victim of intimate partner violence. And I put clinical depression, that means it's diagnosable. We all experience sad or depressed times, especially when something bad has happened in our lives. We have the death of a family member. Of course, that's going to cause us to feel depression. If you lose your job, you're going to feel depressed. But this isn't that type of depression. This is clinical, severe depression. And some of the symptoms of clinical or severe depression is chronic sadness. Like I said, we can all feel sad. We all have bad days. That's part of being a human being. You know, that's part of processing events as we feel sad. But this is chronic sadness. This is a feeling of never feeling joy, never feeling happy, feeling hopeless, that no matter what the person does or thinks or how they change their behavior, they're never going to feel any better. Their circumstance will never improve. Clinical depression actually affects people physically. You can actually see physical signs of severe depression. They tend to speak much slower, and people with severe depression tend to move much slower. Insomnia, we talked about the effects of that in relation to PTSD. Loss of interest. Loss of interest in anything you used to find enjoyable. If you had a hobby you used to love, you don't care about it anymore. If you used to love to shop or spend time with friends, or the one thing that made you feel good was to go for a good long run, and no matter what happened in your day after running, you would just feel so much better. You don't care about any of those things anymore. You have no interest in those things you used to care about. Constant feelings of guilt and shame. Of course, we can all feel feelings of guilt and shame at different times, especially if we've done something we then thought we shouldn't have done. We can experience feelings of guilt and shame. That's part of being human. But this is constant and chronic. Suicidal ideation, thinking about suicide, thinking of ways to commit suicide, being preoccupied with suicide, thinking that suicide is the only answer to what they're currently experiencing. Lack of self-care. We all know that person who they always look amazing, right? Hair done, beard perfectly trimmed, makeup flawless, outfit totally on trend. They're just that person. You just look at it and you go, wow, wish I could get it together like that, right? People like that with severe depression will stop bathing, will stop washing clothes, will stop shaving, will stop doing any of that self-care that makes us all feel good about ourselves, right? Now, a lot of us, me included, don't look flawless all the time, but I take a shower every day. I brush my teeth every day. I shave probably every other day. I use lotion on my face to keep it moist. I use deodorant. I comb my hair. This is all self-care. Most people with severe depression stop demonstrating self-care. Even those that were complete fashion plates suddenly live in pajamas. And substance abuse is a sign of depression. If a person feels hopeless, if they feel like nothing they can do is going to make them feel better, many of these folks resort to using substances to change the way they feel. Drinking alcohol, drinking to excess, using prescription medication, using illegal drugs. Those are all ways to change how you feel. And the bad part about these substances is they tend to change how you feel very quickly. So, for example, if you have severe depression and someone convinces you to go to therapy, going to therapy is not going to make you feel better the first time you go. Maybe not the second time you go, or even the fifth or sixth time you go. That is a long-term solution. It takes a lot of work and it takes considerable amount of time. If you want to change the way you feel right now, this second, drink 3 shots of tequila. You will instantly change how you feel, right? It's very quick. So it's very tempting for people who are suffering to use substances because the effect is immediate. The problem is a lot of the substances people turn to are addictive. That leads to long-term problems. And many of the substances people use are actually depressants. Alcohol is a depressant. It actually slows your thinking. It slows your heart rate. It, in some ways, calms you. But if you do too much of it, if you drink too much, it's actually a depressant. So someone who's already suffering all the symptoms of severe depression who drinks is only going to get worse depression and maybe may even lead them to suicidal ideation or suicide attempts. Substance abuse is also in itself an impact of being the victim of intimate partner violence. And there's 2 ways this comes about. One is many abusers coerce or force their victim to use substances. So by coerce, I mean constantly pressuring, encouraging, goading a person into using substances. Just get high with me. Just get high with me. Please get high with me. If you love me, you get high with me. Come on, get high with me. If you cared about me, just that constant pressure to use substances with the abuser. And again, it could be alcohol. It could be prescription drugs. It could be illegal drugs. The other aspects of substance abuse is many victims, many people who've been abused, use alcohol and drugs to cope with the abuse, to feel better, to feel even just different. And of course, the problem with using substances is you can develop an addiction. There can be legal consequences. You can lose your life abusing substances. So substance abuse can be an effect of intimate partner violence, both because an abuser coerced or forced a victim to use substances, or because a victim turned to using alcohol or other drugs to feel better or to even just feel different. Financial issues. This is one of the impacts of domestic violence we don't hear about as often as we should, because not only is it devastating and life-changing, it's also one of those big reasons that keeps people in abusive relationships. So we can break financial issues into two different categories: tangible and intangible. Tangible means you can feel it, see it, touch it. It's objects, it's things you can hold in your hands. Intangible impacts are things that you can't really put your hands on. It's not about personal property. So examples of tangible financial losses are your residence. If someone leaves an abusive relationship, sometimes the only way they can leave is they have to move out. They have to leave the apartment or the home. That's the only way they can escape their abuser. So now they're literally homeless. They have no place to go. Of course, personal items. Abusers destroy personal items, especially items that are really important or meaningful to the victim. I've heard stories about abusers stealing the only objects a victim has that belong to their own parent or loved one, or a child that they lost to illness, and they have clothes that belong to that child. An abuser will destroy that because they know how meaningful those items are to a victim. Of course, and when you have to move out, especially if you have to move out in the middle of the night in an emergency, you're going to lose all those personal items that you hold so dear. It could include your phone, your laptop, the books that you treasure, your personal records, financial statements, furniture, dishes, all that stuff that we love and use every day. Most victims of domestic violence who lose all or a substantial amount of everything they've ever owned. Job loss is very common for victims of domestic violence, and there's a couple ways this comes about. One is an abuser actually prevents the victim from going to work until the victim loses his or her job. That's an easy way to lose your job. Don't go, don't report to work. So coercing or physically forcing a person from going to their job, and ultimately they lose their job. Some abusers get a really heightened sense of themselves by causing problems for their victim at work, constantly calling the person at work, especially on the business phone. Having them paged is a way to really harass someone at work, showing up at their job, making them late for work, destroying their work projects, taking their uniform. There's all sorts of ways abusers can really interfere with their victim trying to maintain employment. And of course, if you have to move, especially quickly, you may not find housing that you can get to your job. So you may now be in a different town, a different county, a different city, and you can no longer get to the job that you had. Health insurance is a huge one. Unfortunately, health insurance is a huge issue for a lot of people in our country who either are underinsured or can't get health insurance at all. And again, this relates back to those long-term and short-term physical injuries. It's really expensive to go to the emergency room without insurance, and those bills can haunt you for a very long time. Another financial impact is losing auto insurance or the actual vehicle. We all know how abusers like to control. So if the car is in their name, the registration's in their name, the insurance is in their name, if a victim leaves with that car, the abuser can call the police and report it stolen. That's a great way to harass a victim, right? So in addition to all the other issues the victim's facing trying to leave this relationship, now they don't even have a car. They can't get to psychological services. It's hard to get to medical treatment. And it's really hard to get to a job, especially when you're in a place with not a lot of public transportation. So those are just some of the tangible financial issues that victims have to deal with. Then there's just as important intangible items like you have no credit rating because your abusive partner has had everything in his or her name. All the bank accounts are in their name. All the credit cards are in their name. The debit cards are in their name. The savings account is in their name. So the victims developed no credit rating, or their credit rating has been destroyed by the abuser. One way abusers do this is to forge documents and get credit cards in the name of the victim, purchase vehicles under the name of the victim, and then not pay for the victim, not pay for the vehicle, not pay for the insurance, not pay the credit card bill, and destroy the victim's credit rating. So victims often have no credit rating, or they have a destroyed credit rating. Equity. Equity is the money you put into your house. Now, if you're renting, you're not building equity because you pay rent to the person who owns your apartment. But if you own a house and you're paying those monthly mortgage payments every month, you're actually building equity. And that means your house has value. If you have a $200,000 house and you've been paying the mortgage for 10 or 15 or more years, you can actually get loans on the home you own. That's the collateral for a loan. So you can get big loans using a house as collateral. All that money you've put in, all that investment you've put in your house is really worth something. And of course, you lose all that when you have to leave the house. If you have to sell the house, you lose all that. And another intangible is lack of education or training. So just the same way an abuser can really mess things up at their victim's job, prevent them from going to work, or make working extremely uncomfortable for them, they can do the same thing with school, right? Or with any type of job training their victim is in. So if you just look at the financial issues, if that's all somebody suffered in an abusive relationship, the only thing was what you see on this slide, it's overwhelming. Even if this is the only impact you have no place to live, you have no personal items, no clothes, no toiletries, no photo albums, no books, no laptop. You don't have a job or your job's in jeopardy. You don't have health insurance. Your car's not insured if you have the car, and most likely you lost the car. It's devastating, even if you just think about these financial issues. And although we often discuss the physical impact and physical abuse and verbal abuse that victims have to suffer, we don't talk often enough about the financial issues that victims have to contend with. And lastly, there's a lot of legal issues. This comes in a bunch of different forms. One is, again, having to leave where you live can create issues with a lease or with a mortgage. So if you break a lease, your landlord can sue you. If you just walk out of your apartment and you've signed your lease and you say, I'm not living here anymore, your landlord can sue you for all that rent money. And also having to pay a mortgage on a house you don't live in can be incredibly difficult, both emotionally and financially. Orders of protection, those are the orders a victim may seek in court to either keep the abuser away from them, away from their job, away from their home. It can also involve children. In New York State, it can also be an order of protection that includes pets. That's a relatively new thing in New York State. So orders of protections have to be renewed. So you got to go back to court. And who else has to go to court? The abuser has to go back to court. Divorce, obviously, a very long process. Even in New York State, if two people agree to a divorce, it still takes months. Our legal system, it's a good system, but it's not fast, and it's never going to be. And with all the issues around the COVID pandemic and court closures that went on and off for months, our legal system is incredibly backlogged, even more so than usual. So separation proceedings, having to get legally separated from someone, not only requires time and money, it involves having to deal with the abuser. And of course, there could be criminal proceedings. If a victim or someone else reported the victim being sexually assaulted or physically assaulted and the abuser was criminally charged, The victim doesn't just get to walk away from that proceeding and say, let me know if he's convicted. The victim has to testify at the proceeding. The victim's going to be interviewed multiple times by police officers, detectives, attorneys, the attorney for the children. All of these proceedings can take a long time. And if the couple has children, triple the problems, because now they have to work out legal issues related to the residential, legal, and physical custody of the children. Child support issues all have to be handled by the court. And it's extremely rare, and I can't emphasize this enough, extremely rare for a court to rule an abusive partner cannot have any contact with the children ever. That is extremely rare. We have court orders in New York State that require children to visit abusive parents who are in prison for abusing their mom or their dad. So in New York State, the emphasis is very strong for children having contact with their parents, even if one of those parents abused the other. And we're going to talk a lot more about legal issues and the legal system's response to domestic violence in Module 6. So there's a lot more to talk about here. This is just sort of a preview of the legal issues. So that's it for the Module 4 lecture. We're doing a shorter lecture this week because you have a lot of items you need to complete. So just to cover those briefly, there's a reading assignment. It's about 13 pages, but 2 of those pages are just lists of websites I just want you to scan and just become familiar with just how many resources there are online to both research domestic violence and to get help for people who are being victimized by domestic violence. So short reading assignment this week. You have an article from Psychology Today. That article is really well written, and it provides excellent information on the impact of domestic violence on children. So that's why I didn't cover it in the lecture. You're going to specifically learn more about that topic by reading the article. Couple of media items. One is a video where you're going to hear from victims and family members. It's about 21 minutes long, so it's a little longer than most of the videos I show you. But it's a really good video because you get to hear from actual real life people, and it directly relates what they're talking about to the Duluth model's wheel of power and control. The other media item is the actual wheel. You can just open it, read it. That's all you have to do with that. Just familiarize yourself with it. You do have another short essay this week that will be due on Monday. Please pay a special attention to the article about the impact on children, because that's what your writing assignment is going to be about. It's going to be about the impact on children who witness intimate partner violence between their parents and other adults. So pay particular attention to that article because that's going to be the topic of your short essay. The quality of the essays that were submitted for the previous module varied widely in quality. So here's my tips on getting a higher score for your writing assignments. The first one is to review the documents I put on the main menu under the writing assignments. So in there is APA format examples. I just give you the exact citation. All you have to do is copy it. The other is there's a sample essay in there. I wrote an essay for you so you can see actually what I'm looking for. A lot of students ask me that. What are you looking for? I don't know what it is you want me to do or how you want me to write about this. So there's a sample essay on the main menu. There's also a grading rubric, which is just a chart which shows how I grade your essays. And then there's a fourth document which provides detailed information about all of the topics on the grading rubric. There's a section on organization, main issue, typographical errors, grammatical errors, and outside source information. So please, if you're struggling with the reading assignments, please review those documents before you create the short essay for this module. Also, as you saw, I provide detailed information to each student about their first submission. So I really expect students to improve from the first writing assignment to the second. Of course, if you have any questions at all on writing assignments or anything else, please just tell me. This week you do have a quiz. It's a very limited quiz. It's only on Module 3. You need to get your quiz completed by Monday night, September 28th. I know I keep repeating this over and over, but please take the quiz all 3 times. It really is a way of studying, and you do have a midterm for this class that is 25% of your grade. So as you take those quizzes multiple times, you're actually studying for the midterm. Even if you get 100 the first time you take it again. It only takes you a few minutes. And we also have an extra credit assignment this week. A short posting on the discussion board will give you an extra credit point. And the question for this week's discussion board is about the video. So pay particular attention to the article because it's related to your writing assignment, and pay particular attention to the video because you can use info from that video to do a quick extra credit assignment. Again, if there's anything I can do, if you need anything, please send me an email.